Charles Kingsley, At Last, A Christmas in the West Indies, narrated by Peter Walters. My dear Sir Arthur Gordon, to whom should I dedicate this book but to you, to whom I owe my visit to the West Indies? I regret that I could not consult you about certain matters in chapters 14 and 15, but you are away again oversea, and I can only send the book after you, such as it is, with the expression of my hearty belief that you will be to the people of Mauritius what you have been to the people of Trinidad. I could say much more, but it is wisest often to be most silent on the very points on which one longs most to speak. Ever yours, C. Kingsley. Chapter 1, Outward Bound. At last we too were crossing the Atlantic. At last the dream of 40 years, please God, would be fulfilled. And I should see, and happily not alone, the West Indies and the Spanish Main. From childhood I had studied their natural history, their charts, their romances, and alas, their tragedies. And now at last I was about to compare books with facts and judge for myself of the reported wonders of the earthly paradise. We could scarce believe the evidence of our own senses when they told us that we were surely on board a West Indian steamer and could by no possibility get off it again, save into the ocean or on the farther side of the ocean. And it was not till the morning of the second day of the 3rd of December that we began to be thoroughly aware that we were on the old route of Westward Ho, and far out in the high seas, while the old world lay behind us like a dream. Like dreams seemed now the last farewells over the taffrail, behind the chill, low December sun, and the shining calm of Southampton water, and the pleasant and well-beloved old shores and woods and houses sliding by, and the fisher boats at anchor off Calshot, their brown and olive sails reflected in the dun water, with dun clouds overhead tipped with dull red from off the setting sun. A study for Vanderveld or Backhuizen in the tenderest moods. Like a dream seemed the twin lights of Hurst Castle and the Needles, glaring out of the gloom behind us, as if old England were watching us to the last with careful eyes and bidding us good speed upon our way. Then had come, still like a dream, a day of pouring rain, of lounging on the main deck, watching the engines, and watching too, for it was calm at night, the water from the sponson behind the paddle boxes, as the live flame heads leaped and ran amid the swirling snow, while some 15 feet beyond the untouched oily black of the deep sea spread away into the endless dark. It took a couple of days to arrange our little cabin penates, to discover who was on board, and a couple of days too to become aware, in spite of sudden starts of anxiety, that there were no post, and could be none, that one could not be wanted, or, if one was wanted, found and caught. And it was not till the 4th morning that the glorious sense of freedom dawned on the mind, as through the cabin port the sunrise shone in, yellow and wild through flying showers, and great north-eastern waves raced past us, their heads torn off in spray, their broad backs laced with ripples, and each as it passed gave us a friendly onward lift away into the roaring 40s, as the sailors call the stormy seas between 50 and 40 degrees of latitude. These roaring 40s seem all strangely devoid of animal life. At least in a December northeast gale, not a whale did we see, only a pair of porpoises. Not a seabird, save a lonely little kittiwake or two, who swung round our stern in quest of food. But the seeming want of life was only owing to our want of eyes. Each night the wake teemed more bright with flame atomies. One kind were little brilliant sparks, hurled helpless to and fro on the surface, probably noctilucae. The others, what they may be we could not guess at first, showed patches of soft diffused light, paler than the sparks, yet of the same yellow-white hue, which floated quietly past, seeming a foot or two below the foam. And at the bottom, far beneath, deeper under our feet than the summit of the Peak of Tenerife was above our heads, for we were now in more than 2,000 fathoms of water, what exquisite forms might there not be, myriads on myriads, generations on generations, people the eternal darkness, seen only by him to whom the darkness is as light as day, and to be seen hereafter, a few of them, but how few, when future men of science shall do for this mid-Atlantic seafloor what Dr. Carpenter and Dr. Wyville Thomson have done for the North Atlantic, and open one more page of that book which has, to us creatures of a day, though not to him who wrote it as the time pattern of his timeless mind, neither beginning nor end. So, for want of animal life to study, we were driven to study the human life around us, pent up there in our little iron world. But to talk too much of fellow passengers is, though usual enough just now, neither altogether fair nor kind. We see in travel but the outside of people, and as we know nothing of their inner history, and little usually of their antecedents, the pictures which we might sketch of them would be probably as untruthful as rashly drawn. Crushed together too, perforce, against each other, people are apt on board ship to make little hasty confidences, to show unawares little weaknesses, which should be forgotten all round the moment they step on shore and return to something like a normal state of society. The wisest and most human rule for a traveller toward his companion is to be to their faults a little blind, be to their virtues very kind, and to consider all that is said and done on board, like what passes among the members of the same club, as on the whole private and confidential. So, let it suffice that there were on board the good steamship Shannon, as was to be expected, plenty of kind, courteous, generous, intelligent people, officials, travellers. One happy man, away to discover new birds on the yet unexplored Rio Magdalena in New Granada. Planters, merchants, what not, all ready, when once at St. Thomas's, to spread themselves over the islands and the Spanish Main and the Isthmus of Panama, and after that, some of them down to the Pacific shore of Callao and Valparaiso. The very names of their different destinations and the imagination of the wonders they would see, though we were going to a spot as full of wonders as any, raised something like envy in our breasts, all the more because most of them persisted in tantalizing us, in the hospitable fashion of all West Indians, by fruitless invitations to islands and ports, which, to have seen, were a joy for ever. But almost the most interesting group of all was one of Cornish miners from the well-known old Redruth and Camborne county, and the old sacred hill of Carn Bray, who were going to seek their fortunes a while in silver mines among the Andes, leaving wives and children at home, and hoping, if it pleased God to do some good out there, and send their earnings home. Stout, bearded, high cheekbone men they were, dressed in the thick coats and rough caps, and of course in the indispensable black cloth trousers which make a miner's full dress, and their faces lighted up at the old password of "Down along," for whosoever knows "Down along" and the speech thereof is at once a friend and a brother. We had many a pleasant talk with them ere we parted at St. Thomas's. And on to St. Thomas's we were hurrying, and thanks to the north-east wind as straight as a bee-line. On the third day we ran 254 miles, on the fourth 260, and on the next day at noon, where should we be? Nearing the Azores, and by midnight running past them, and away on the track of Columbus towards the Sargasso Sea. We stayed up late on the night of December the 7th, in hopes of seeing, as we passed Terceira, even the loom of the land. But the moon was down, and a glimpse of the Pico at dawn the next morning was our only chance of seeing, at least for this voyage, those wondrous Isles of the Blessed. Isles of the Blessed of old. And why not still? They too are said to be earthly paradises in soil, climate, productions, and yet no English care to settle there, nor even to go thither for health, though the voyage from Lisbon is but a short one, and our own mail steamers, were it made worth their while, could as easily touch at Terceira now as they did a few years since. And as we look out into the darkness, we could not but recollect with a flush of pride that yonder on the starboard beam lay Flores, and the scene of that great fight off the Azores, on August the 30th, 1591, made ever memorable by the pen of Walter Raleigh, and of late by Mr. Froude, in which the Revenge, with Sir Richard Granville for her captain, endured for 12 hours before she struck the attack of 8 great Spanish armadas, of which 2, 3 times her own burden, sank at her side, and after all her masts were gone, and she had been 3 times boarded without success, defied to the last the whole fleet of 51 sail, which lay around her, waiting, like dogs around the dying forest king, for the Englishman to strike or sink. Yonder away it was, that, wounded again and shot through body and through head, Sir Richard Grenville was taken on board the Spanish admiral's ship to die, and give up his gallant ghost with those once famous words, "Here die I, Richard Grenville, with a joyful and quiet mind. For that I have endured my life as a true soldier ought, fighting for his country, queen, religion, and honour, my soul willingly departing from this body, leaving behind the lasting fame of having behaved as every valiant soldier is in his duty bound to do." Yes, we were on the track of the old sea heroes, of Drake and Hawkins, Carlyle and Cavendish, Cumberland and Raleigh, Preston and Somers, Frobisher and Dudley, Keymis and Whiddon, which last, in that same Flores fight, stood by Sir Richard Grenville all alone, and in a small ship called the Pilgrim hovered all night to see the success. But in the morning, bearing with the Revenge, was hunted like a hare among many ravenous hounds, but escaped, to learn in after years, in company with hapless Keymis, only too much about that Trinidad and Gulf of Paria, whither we were bound. Yes, there were heroes in England in those days. Are we, their descendants, degenerate from them? I for one believe not, but they were taught what we take pride in refusing to be taught, namely, to obey. The morning dawned, but Pico, some 50 miles away, was taking his morning bath among the clouds and gave no glimpse of his 11,000 feet crater cone, now capped, they said, with winter snow. Yet neither last night's outlook nor that morning's was without result, for as the steamer stopped last night to pack her engines and slipped along under sail at some 3 knots an hour, we made out clearly that the larger diffused patches of phosphorescence were medusae, slowly opening and shutting and rolling over and over now and then, giving out their light as they rolled, seemingly from the thin limb alone and not from the crown of their bell. And as we watched, a fellow passenger told how between Ceylon and Singapore he had once witnessed that most rare and unexplained phenomenon of a milky sea, of which Dr. Collingwood writes, without, if I remember right, having seen it himself, in his charming book A Naturalist's Rambles in the China Seas. Our friend described the appearance of that of a sea of shining snow rather than of milk, heaving gently beneath a starlit but moonless sky. A bucket of water, when taken up, was filled with the same half-luminous whiteness which stuck to its sides when the water was drained off. The captain of the Indiaman was well enough aware of the rarity of the sight to call all the passengers on deck to see what they would never see again, and on asking our captain, he assured us that he had not only never seen, but never heard of the appearance in the West Indies. One curious fact, then, was verified that night. The next morning gave us unmistakable tokens that we were nearing the home of the summer and the sun. A northeast wind, which would in England keep the air at least at freezing in the shade, gave here a temperature just over 60 degrees, and gave clouds too, which made us fancy for a moment that we were looking at an April thunder sky, soft, fantastic, barred, and feathered bright white where they ballooned out above into cumuli, rich purple in their massive shadows and dropping from their under edges long sheets of inky rain. Thanks to the brave northeaster, we had gained in 5 days 30 degrees of heat, and had slipped out of December into May. The northeaster, too, was transforming itself more and more into the likeness of a southwest wind, say, rather renewing its own youth, and becoming once more what it was when it started on its long journey from the tropics towards the pole. As it rushes back across the ocean, thrilled and expanded by the heat, it opens its dry and thirsty lips to suck in the damp from below, till, saturated once more with steam, it will reach the tropic as a grey, rain-laden sky of northeast trade. So we slipped on, day after day, in a delicious repose which yet was not monotonous. Those indeed who complain of the monotony of a voyage must have either very few resources in their own minds, or much worse company than we had on board the Shannon. Here, every hour brought, or might bring, to those who wished not merely agreeable conversation about the old world behind us, but fresh, valuable information about the new world before us. One morning, for instance, I stumbled on a merchant returning to Suriname, who had 50 things to tell of his own special business, of the woods, the drugs, the barks, the vegetable oils, which he was going back to procure. A whole new world of yet unknown wealth and use. Most cheering, too, and somewhat unexpected, were the facts we heard of the improving state of our West India colonies, in which the tide of fortune seems to have turned at last, and the gallant race of planters and merchants, in spite of obstacle on obstacle, some of them unjust and undeserved, are winning their way back, in their own opinion, to a prosperity more sound and lasting than that which collapsed so suddenly at the end of the Great French War. All spoke of the emancipation of the slaves in Cuba, an event certain to come to pass ere long, as the only condition which they required to put them on an equal footing with any producers whatsoever in the New World. However pleasant, though, the conversation might be, the smallest change in external circumstances, the least break in the perpetual, quocumque ad specias nil est nisi pontus et air. Even a passing bird, if one would pass, which none would do save once or twice a stately tropic bird, wheeling around aloft like an eagle, was hailed as an event in the day, and on the 9th of December the appearance of the first fragments of gulfweed caused quite a little excitement, and set an enthusiastic pair of naturalists, a Midland hunting squire and a travelled scientific doctor who had been 12 years in the Eastern Archipelago, fishing eagerly over the bows with an extemporized grapple of wire for gulfweed, a specimen of which they did not catch. However, more and more still would come in a day or two, perhaps whole acres, even whole leagues, and then, so we hoped, but hoped in vain, we should have our feast of zoophytes, crustacea, and what not. Meanwhile, it must be remembered that this gulfweed has not, as some of the uninitiated fancy from its name, anything to do with the Gulf Stream, along the southern edge of which we were steaming. Thrust away to the south by the great ocean river, it lies in a vast eddy, or central pool of the Atlantic, between the Gulf Stream and the equatorial current, unmoved save by surface drifts of wind, as floating weeds collect and range slowly round and round in the still corners of a tumbling bay or salmon pool. One glance at a bit of the weed as it floats past showed that it is like no fucus of our shores, or anything we ever saw before. The difference of look is undefinable in words, but clear enough. One sees in a moment that the sargassos, of which there are several species on tropical shores, are a genus of themselves and by themselves, and a certain awe may, if the beholder be at once scientific and poetical, come over him at the first sight of this famous and unique variety thereof, which has lost ages since the habit of growing on rock or sea bottom, but propagates itself forever floating, and feeds among its branches a whole family of fish, crabs, cuttlefish, zoophytes, molluscs, which, like the plant which shelters them, are found nowhere else in the world. And that awe springing from the scientific use of the imagination would be increased if he recollected the theory, not altogether impossible, that this sargasso, and probably some of the animals which cling to it, marks the site of an Atlantic continent, sunk long ages since, and that, transformed by the necessities of life from a rooting to a floating plant. Still it remembers its august abodes, and wanders round and round as if in search of the rocks where it once grew. We looked eagerly day by day for more and more gulfweed, hoping that slimy things would crawl with legs upon that slimy sea, and thought of the memorable day when Columbus's ship first plunged her bows into the tangled ocean meadow, and the sailors, naturally enough, were ready to mutiny, fearing hidden shoals, ignorant that they had 4 miles of blue water beneath their keel, and half recollecting old Greek and Phoenician legends of a weedy sea off the coast of Africa, where the vegetation stopped the ships and kept them entangled till all on board were starved. Day after day we passed more and more of it, often in long processions, ranged in the direction of the wind, while a few feet below the surface here and there floated large fronds of a lettuce-like weed, seemingly an ulva, the bright green of which, as well as the rich orange hue of the sargasso, brought out by contrast the intense blue of the water. Very remarkable, meanwhile, and unexpected, was the opacity and seeming solidity of the ocean when looked down on from the bows. Whether sapphire under the sunlight, or all but black under the clouds, or laced and streaked with beads of foam rising out of the nether darkness, it looks as if it could resist the hand, as if one might almost walk on it. So unlike any liquid as seen near shore or inland is this leaping, heaving plain, reminding one by its innumerable conchoidal curves not of water, not even of ice, but rather of obsidian. After all, we got little of the sargasso. Only in a sailing ship and in calms or light breezes can its treasures be explored. 12 knots an hour is a pace sufficient to tear off the weed as it's hauled alongside all living things which are not rooted to it. We got, therefore, no crustacea. Neither did we get a single specimen of the calamaries, which may be described as cuttlefish carrying hooks on their arms as well as suckers, and lingering descendants of a most ancient form which existed at least as far back as the era of the shallow Oolitic seas, X or Y 1,000 years ago. A tiny curled Spirorbis, a Lepraria with its thousandfold cells, and a tiny polyp belonging to the Campanularius with a creeping stem which sends up here and there a yellow-stalked bell, were all the parasites we saw. But the sargasso itself is a curious instance of the fashion in which one form so often mimics another of a quite different family. When fresh out of the water it resembles not a seaweed so much as a sprig of some willow-leaved shrub, burdened with yellow berries, large and small. For every broken bit of it seems growing, and throwing out ever new berries and leaves, or what, for want of a better word, must be called leaves in a seaweed. For it must be remembered that the frond of a seaweed is not merely leaf, but root also, that it not only breathes air, but feeds on water, and that even the so-called root by which a seaweed holds to the rock is really only an anchor, holding mechanically to the stone, but not deriving, as the root of a land plant would, any nourishment from it. Therefore it is that to grow while uprooting and floating, though impossible to most land plants, is easy enough to many seaweeds, and especially to the sargasso. The fly-fish now began to be a source of continual amusement as they scuttled away from under the bows of the ship, mistaking her, probably, for some huge devouring whale. So strange are they when first seen, though long read of and long looked for, that it is difficult to recollect that they are actually fish. The first little one was mistaken for a dragonfly, the first big one for a grey plover. The flight is almost exactly like that of a quail or partridge. Flight, I must say, for, in spite of all that has been learnedly written to the contrary, it was too difficult as yet for the English sportsmen on board to believe that their motion was not a true flight, aided by the vibration of the wings, and not a mere impulse given, as in the leap of the salmon, by a rush under water. That they can change their course at will is plain to one who looks down on them from the lofty deck, and still more from the paddle box. The length of the flight seems too great to be attributed to a few strokes of the tail, while the plain fact that they renew their flight after touching, and only touching, the surface would seem to show that it was not due only to the original impetus, for that would be retarded instead of being quickened every time they touched. Such were our first impressions, and they were confirmed by what we saw on the voyage home. The nights as yet we will not say disappointed us, for to see new stars like Canopus and Fomalhaut shining in the far south, even to see Sirius in his ever-changing blaze of red and blue, riding high in a December heaven, is interesting enough, but the brilliance of the stars is not, at least at this season, equal to that of a frosty sky in England. Nevertheless, to make up for the deficiency, the clouds were glorious, so glorious that I longed again and again, as I did afterwards in the West Indies, that Mr. Ruskin were by my side, to see and to describe as none but he can do. The evening skies are fit weeds for widowed Eos, weeping over the dying sun. Thin, formless, rent in carelessness, not in rage, and of all the hues of early autumn leaves, purple and brown, with green and primrose lakes of air between, but all hues weakened, mingled, chastened into loneliness, tenderness, regretfulness, through which still shines in endless vistas of clear western light the hope of the returning day. More and more faint the pageant fades below towards the white haze of the horizon, where, in sharpest contrast, leaps and welters against it in the black jagged sea, and richer it glows upwards, till it cuts the azure overhead, until, only too soon, the sun's rim dips, the stars rush out, at one stride comes the dark, to be succeeded, after the long balmy night, by a sunrise which repeats the colours of the sunset, but this time gaudy, dazzling, triumphant, as befits the season of faith and hope. Such imagery, it may be said, is hackneyed now, and trite even to impertinence. It may be so at home, but here, in presence of the magnificent pageant of tropic sunlight, it is natural, almost inevitable, and the old myth of the daily birth and death of Helios, and the bridal joys and widowed tears of Eos, reinvents itself in the human mind as soon as it asserts its power. It may be its sacred right to translate nature into the language of feelings. And meanwhile, may we not ask, have we not a right, founded on that common sense of the heart, which often is the deepest reason to ask, if we, gross and purblind mortals, can perceive and sympathize with so much beauty in the universe, then how much must not he perceive? With how much must not he sympathize? For whose pleasure all things are and were created. Who that believes, and rightly, the sense of beauty to be among the noblest faculties of man, will deny that faculty to God, who conceived man and all besides. Wednesday the 15th was a really tropic day, blazing heat in the forenoon, with the thermometer at 82 degrees in the shade, and in the afternoon stifling clouds from the southwest, where a dark band of rain showed, according to the planter's dictum, showers over the islands, which were nearing fast. At noon we were only 210 miles from Sombrero, the Spanish Hat, a lonely island which is here the first outlier of the New World. We ought to have passed it by sunrise on the 16th, and by the afternoon reached St. Thomas's, where our pleasant party would burst like a shell in all directions and scatter its fragments about all coasts and isles, from Demerara to Panama, from Mexico to the Bahamas. So that day was to the crew a day of hard, hot work, of lifting and sorting goods on the main deck, in readiness for the arrival at St. Thomas's, and of moving forwards 2 huge empty boilers which had graced our spar deck, filled with barrels of onions and potatoes all the way from Southampton. But in the soft, hot evening hours, time was found for the usual dance on the quarter-deck, with the band under the awning and lamps throwing fantastic shadows and waltzing couples, and the crew clustering aft to see, while we old folks looked on, with our ludite dum lubet pueri, till the captain bade the sergeant-at-arms leave the lights burning for an extra half-hour, and Sir Roger de Coverley was danced out to the great amusement of the foreigners, at actually 11:30, after which unexampled dissipation all went off to rest, promising to themselves and their partners that they would get up at sunrise to sight Sombrero. But as it befell, morning's waking brought only darkness, the heavy pattering of a tropic shower, and the absence of the everlasting roll of the paddle wheels. We were crawling slowly along in thick haze and heavy rain, having passed Sombrero unseen, and were away in a grey, shoreless world of waters, looking out for Virgin Gorda, the first of those numberless isles which Columbus, so goes the tale, discovered on St. Ursula's Day, and named them after the saint and her 11,000 mythical virgins. Unfortunately, English buccaneers have since then given to most of them less poetic names. The Dutchman's Cap, Broken Jerusalem, the Dead Man's Chest, Rum Island, and so forth, mark a time and a race more prosaic, but still more terrible, though not one whit more wicked and brutal than the Spanish conquistadores, whose descendants in the 17th century they smote hip and thigh with great destruction. The farthest of these Virgin Islands is St. Thomas's, and there ended the first and longer part of a voyage unmarred by the least discomfort, discourtesy, or dullness, and full of enjoyment, for which thanks are due alike to captain, officers, crew, and passengers, and also to our much maligned friend the north-east wind, who caught us up in the chops of the channel, helped us graciously on nearly to the Tropic of Cancer, giving us a more prosperous passage than the oldest hands recollect at this season, and then left us for a while to the delicious calms of the edge of the tropic, to catch us up again as the north-east trade. Truly, this voyage had already given us much for which to thank God. If safety and returning health, in an atmosphere in which the mere act of breathing is a pleasure, be things for which to be thankful, then we had reason to say in our hearts that which is sometimes best unsaid on paper. Our first day in a tropic harbour was spent in what might be taken at moments for a dream. Did not shells and flowers remain to bear witness to its reality? It was on Friday morning, December the 17th, that we first sighted the New World, and rounded hill some 1,500 feet high, which was the end of Virgin Gorda. That resolved itself, as we ran on, into a cluster of long, low islands, St. John's appearing next on the horizon, then Tortola, and last of all St. Thomas's, all pink and purple in the sun, and warm grey in the shadow, which again became, as we neared them one after the other, richest green of scrub and down, with bright yellow and rusty rocks, plainly lava in low cliffs along the shore. The upper outline of the hills reminded me, with its multitudinous little coves and dry gullies, of the Vivares or Auvergne Hills, and still more of the sketches of the Chinese tea mountains in Fortune's book. Their waterline had been exposed, evidently for many ages, to the gnawing of the sea at the present level. Everywhere the lava cliffs are freshly broken, toppling down in dust and boulders and leaving detached stacks and skerries like that called the Indians, from its supposed likeness to a group of red-brown savages afloat in a canoe. But as far as I could see, there had been no upheaval since the land took its present shape. There is no trace of raised beaches or of terraces which would have inevitably been formed by upheaval on the soft sides of lava hills. The numberless deep channels which part the isles and islets would rather mark depressions still going on. Most beautiful, meanwhile, are the winding channels of blue water like landlocked lakes, which part the virgins from each other, and beautiful the white triangular sails of the canoe-rigged craft, which beat up and down them through strong currents and cockling seas. The clear air, the still soft outlines, the rich and yet delicate colouring stir up a sense of purity and freshness, and peace and cheerfulness, such as is stirred up by certain views of the Mediterranean, only broken by one ghastly sight: the lonely mast of the ill-fated Rhone, standing up still where she sank with all her crew in the hurricane of 1867. At length, in the afternoon, we neared the last point, and turning inside an isolated and crumbling hummock, the Dutchman's Cap saw before us, at the head of a little narrow harbour, the scarlet and purple roofs of St. Thomas's, piled up amongst orange trees at the foot of a green corrie, or rather couple of corries, some 800 feet high. There it was, as veritable a Dutch oven for cooking fever in, with as veritable a dripping pan for the poison when concocted in the tideless basin below the town, as ever man invented. And we were not sorry when the superintendent, coming on board, bade us steam back again out of the port and round a certain water island at the back of which is a second and healthier harbour, the Gree Channel. In the port, close to the town, we could discern another token of the late famous hurricane: the funnels and masts of the hapless Columbia, which lies still on the top of the sunken floating clock, immovable as yet by the art of man. But some 100 yards on to our right was a low cliff, which was even more interesting to some of us than either the town or the wreck, for it was covered with the first tropic vegetation which we had ever seen. Already on a sandy beach outside, we had caught sight of unmistakable coconut trees, some of them, however, dying, dead, even snapped short off, either by the force of the hurricane or by the ravages of the beetle, which seems minded of late years to exterminate the coconut throughout the West Indies, belonging, we are told, to the elaters, firefly or skipjack beetles. His grub, like that of his cousin, our English wireworm, and his nearer cousin, the great wireworm of the sugar-cane, eats into the pith and marrow of the growing shoots, and as the palm, being an endogen, increases from within by one bud, and therefore by one shoot only, when that is eaten out, nothing remains for the tree but to die. And so it happens that almost every coconut grove which we have seen has a sad and shabby look, as if it existed, which it really does, merely on sufferance. But on this cliff we could see, even with the naked eye, tall aloes, grey-blue cereae, like the huge branching candelabra, and bushes the foliage of which was utterly unlike anything in northern Europe, while above, the bright deep green of a patch of guinea grass marked cultivation, and a few fruit trees round a cottage told, by their dark bay-like foliage, of fruits whose names alone were known to us. Round Water Island we went, into a narrow channel between steep green hills, covered to their tops as late as 1845 with sugar cane, but now only with scrub, among which the ruins of mills and buildings stood sad and lonely. But nature in this land of perpetual summer hides with a kind of eagerness every scar which man in his clumsiness leaves on the earth's surface, and all, though relapsing into primeval wilderness, was green, soft, luxuriant, as if the hoe had never torn the ground, contrasting strangely with the water scene, with the black steamers snorting in their sleep, the wrecks and condemned hulks in process of breaking up, strewing the shores with their timbers, the boatfuls of negroes gliding to and fro, and all the signs of our hasty, irreverent, wasteful, semi-barbarous mercantile system, which we call, for the time being only, it is to be hoped, civilization. The engine had hardly stopped when we were boarded from a fleet of negro boats, and huge bunches of plantains, yams, green oranges, junks of sugar cane were displayed upon the deck, and more than one of the ladies went through the ceremony of initiation into West Indian ways, which consisted in sucking sugar cane, first pared for the sake of their teeth. The negroes stronger incisors tear it without paring. Two amusing figures, meanwhile, had taken up their station close to the companion. Evidently privileged personages, they felt themselves on their own ground and looked around patronizingly on the passengers as ignorant foreigners who were too certain to be tempted by the treasures which they displayed to need any solicitations. One went by the name of Jamaica Joe, a negro blacker than the night, in smart white coat and smart black trousers, a tall, courtly gentleman, with the organ of self-interest, to judge from his physiognomy, very highly developed. But he was thrown into the shade by a stately brown lady who was still very handsome, beautiful if you will, and knew it, and had put on her gorgeous turban with grace, and plaited her short locks under it with care, and ignored the very existence of a mere negro like Jamaica Joe, as she sat by her cigars, and slow match and eau de cologne at 4 times the right price, and mats, necklaces, bracelets made of mimosa seeds, white negro hats, nest of curaçao baskets, and so forth. They drove a thriving trade among all newcomers, but were somewhat disgusted to find that we, though new to the West Indies, were by no means new to West Indian wares, and therefore not of the same mind as a gentleman and lady who came fresh from the town next day, with nearly a bushel of white branching madrepores, which they were going to carry as coals to Newcastle, 600 miles down the islands. Poor Joe tried to sell us a nest of curaçao baskets for 7 shillings, retired after a firm refusal, came up again to R after a couple of hours, and said in a melancholy and reproachful voice, "Da, take them for 4 shilling and 6pence. I give them you." But now, would we go on shore? To the town? Not we. We came to see nature, not towns. Some went off on honest business, some on such pleasure as can be found in baking streets, hotel bars, and billiard rooms. But the one place on which our eyes were set was a little cove a quarter of a mile off, under the steep hill, where a white line of sand shone between blue water and green wood. A few yards broad of sand, and then impenetrable jungle, among which we could see below the curved yellow stems of the coconuts, and higher up the straight grey stems and broad fan leaves of carrot palms, which I regret to say we did not reach. Oh, for a boat to get into that paradise! There were 3/4 of an hour left between dinner and dark, and in 3/4 of an hour what might not be seen in a world where all was new? The kind chief officer, bidding us not to trust negro boats on such a trip, lent us one of the ships, with 4 honest fellows thankful enough to escape from heat and smoke, and away we went with 2 select companions, the sportsman and our scientific friend, to land for the first time in the new world. As we leapt on shore on that white sand, what feelings passed through the heart of at least one of us, who found the dream of 40 years translated into fact at last! Our best, perhaps, left untold here, but it must be confessed that ere we had stood for 2 minutes staring at the green wall opposite us, astonishment soon swallowed up for the first time all other emotions. Astonishment, not at the vast size of anything, for the scrub was not 30 feet high, nor at the gorgeous colours, for very few plants or trees were in flower, but at the wonderful wealth of life, the massiveness, the strangeness, the variety, the very length of the young and still growing shoots was a wonder. We tried at first in vain to fix our eyes on some one dominant or typical form, while every form was clamouring, as it were, to be looked at, and a fresh dryad gazed out of every bush, and with wooing eyes asked to be wooed again. The first 2 plants, perhaps, we looked steadily at were the Impomea pescapre, lying along the sand in straight shoots 30 feet long, and growing longer, we fancied, while we looked at it, with large belobed green leaves at every joint, and here and there a great purple convolvulus flower, and next what we knew at once for the shore grape. We had fancied it, and correctly, to be a mere low bushy tree with roundish leaves. But what a bush! With drooping boughs arched over and through each other, shoots already 6 feet long, leaves as big as the hand shining like dark velvet, a crimson midrib down each, and tiled over each other, imbricated, as the botanists would say, in that fashion which gives its peculiar solidity and richness of light and shade to the foliage of an old sycamore. And among these noble shoots and noble leaves, pendant everywhere, long tapering spires of green grapes. This shore grape, which the West Indians esteem as we might a bramble, we found to be without exception the most beautiful broad-leaf plant which we had ever seen. Then we admired the Frangipani, a tall and almost leafless shrub with thick fleshy shoots, bearing in this species white flowers, which have the fragrance peculiar to certain white blossoms, to the jessamine, the tuberose, and the orange, and the gardenia, the night-flowering cereus, then the cacti and aloes, then the first coconut, with its last year's leaves pale yellow, its new leaves deep green, and its trunk ringing when struck, like metal, then the sensitive plants, then creeping lianes of a dozen different kinds. Then we shrank back from our first glimpse of a little swamp of foul brown water, backed up by the sand brush with trees in every stage of decay, fallen and tangled into a doleful thicket through which the spider-legged mangroves rose on stilted roots. We turned in wholesome dread to the white beach outside and picked up, and alas, wreck, everywhere wreck, shells, old friends in the cabinets at home, as earnests to ourselves that all was not a dream. Delicate prickly pinnae, Noah's arks in abundance, great strombi, their lips and outer shell broken away, disclosing the rosy cameo within, and looking on the rough beach pitifully tender and flesh-like, lumps and fragments of coral innumerable, reminding us by their worn and rounded shapes of those which abound in so many secondary strata, and then hastened on board the boat, for the sun had already fallen, the purple night set in, and from the woods on shore a chorus of frogs had commenced chattering, quacking, squealing, whistling, not to cease till sunrise. So ended our first trip in the New World, and we got back to the ship, but not to sleep. Already a coal barge lay on either side of her, and over the coals we scrambled through a scene which we would fain forget. Black women on one side were doing men's work, with heavy coal baskets on their heads, amid screaming, chattering, and language of which, happily, we understood little or nothing. On the other, a gang of men and boys, who, as the night fell, worked, many of them altogether naked, their glossy bronze figures gleaming in the red lamplight, and both men and women singing over their work in wild choruses, which, when the screaming, cracked voices of the women were silent, and the really rich tenors of the men had it to themselves, was not unpleasant. A lad, seeming the poet of the gang, stood on the sponson, and in the momentary intervals of work improvised some story, while the men below took up and finished each verse with a refrain, piercing, sad, running up and down large and easy intervals. The tunes were many and seemingly familiar, all barbaric, often ending in the minor key and reminding us much, perhaps too much, of the old Gregorian tones. The words were all but unintelligible. In one song we caught New York again and again, and then, Captain, he heard it. He was troubled in him mind. Yah-he-ho-ho-oh, followed the chorus. Captain, he go to him cabin, he drink him wine and whiskey. Yah-he, etc. You go to America, you as well go to heaven. Yah-he, etc. These were all the scraps of Negro poetry which we could overhear, while on deck the band was playing quadrilles and waltzes, setting the Negro shovelers dancing in the black water at the barge bottom, shovel in hand, and pleasant white folks danced under the awning, till the contrast between the refinement within and the brutality without became very painful. For brutality it was, not merely in the eyes of the sentimentalist, but in those of the moralist, still more in the eyes of those who try to believe that all God's human children may be somewhere, somehow reformed into his likeness. We were shocked to hear that another island the evils of coaling are still worse, and that the white authorities have tried in vain to keep them down. The coaling system is, no doubt, demoralizing in itself, as it enables Negroes of the lowest class to earn enough in one day to keep them in idleness, even in luxury, for a week or more, till the arrival of the next steamer. But what we saw proceeded rather from the mere excitability and coarseness of half-civilized creatures than from any deliberate depravity, and we were told that in the island just mentioned, the Negroes, when forced to coal on Sunday or on Christmas Day, always abstain from noise or foul language, and, if they sing, sing nothing but hymns. It is easy to sneer at such a fashion as formalism. It would be wiser to consider whether the first step in religious training must not be obedience to some external positive law, whether the savage must not be taught that there are certain things which he ought never to do, by being taught that there is one day at least on which he shall not do them. How else is man to learn that the laws of right and wrong, like the laws of the physical world, are entirely independent of him, his likes or dislikes, knowledge or ignorance of them, that by law he is environed from his cradle to his grave, and that it is at his own peril that he disobeys the law? A higher religion may, and ought to, follow one in which the law becomes a law of liberty and a gospel, because it is loved and obeyed for its own sake. But even he who has attained to that must be reminded again and again, alas, that the law which he loves does not depend for its sanction on his love of it, on his passing frames or feelings, but is as awfully independent of him as it is of the veriest heathen. And that lesson the Sabbath does teach as few or no other institutions can. The man who says, and says rightly, that to the Christian all days ought to be Sabbaths, must be answered, and answered rightly, all the more reason for keeping one day which shall be a Sabbath, whether you are in a sabbatical mood or not. All the more reason for keeping one day holy as a pattern of what all days should be. So we will be glad if the Negro has got thus far, as an earnest that he may some day get farther still. That night, however, he kept no Sabbath, and we got no sleep, and we were glad enough before sunrise to escape once more to the cove we had visited the evening before. Not that it was prettier or more curious than others, but simply because it is better for those who wish to learn accurately to see one thing twice than many things once. A lesson is never learned till it is learned over many times, and a spot is best understood by staying in it and mastering it. In natural history, the old scholars saw of cave hominem unius libri may be paraphrased by he is a thoroughly good naturalist who knows one parish thoroughly. So, back to our little beach we went, and walked it all over again, finding, of course, many things which had escaped us the night before. We saw our first mellocactus and our first night-blowing cereus creeping over the rocks. We found our first tropic orchid with white, lilac and purple flowers on a stalk 3 feet high. We saw our first wild pines, Tillandsias, etc., clinging parasitic on the boughs of strange trees, or nestling among the angular limb-like shoots of the columnar cereus. We learned to distinguish the poisonous manchineel, and were thankful in serious earnest that we had happily plucked none the night before, when we were snatching at every new leaf, for its milky juice, by mere dropping on the skin, burns like the poisoned tunic of Nessus, and will even, when the head is injured by it, cause blindness and death. We gathered a nosegay of the loveliest flowers under a burning sun within 10 days of Christmas, and then wandered off for the shore up a little path in the red lava toward a farm where we expected to see fresh curiosities, and not in vain. On one side of the path a hedge of penguin, Bromelia, the plants like huge pineapple plants without the fruit, was but 3 feet high, but from its prickles utterly impenetrable to man or beast, and inside the hedge a tree like a straggling pear, with huge green calabashes growing out of its bark, Here was actually Crescentia courgette, the plaything of one's childhood, alive and growing. The other side was low scrub, prickly shrubs like acacias and mimosas, covered with a creeping vine with brilliant yellow hair. We had seen it already from the ship, gilding large patches of the slopes, most like European dodder. Among it rose the tall Calotropis procera, with its fleshy grey stems and leaves, and its azure of lovely lilac flowers, with curious columns of stamens in each. The common accompaniment of a West India kitchen door, the magic trees, whose leaves rubbed on the toughest meat make it tender on the spot, and whose fruit makes the best of sauce or pickle to be eaten therewith, namely a male and female papaw, Carica papaya, their stems some 15 feet high, with a flat crown of mallow-like leaves, just beneath which in the male grew clusters of fragrant flowerets, in the female clusters of unripe fruit. On through the farmyard, picking fresh flowers at every step, and down to a shady cove, for the sun, even at 8 o'clock in December, was becoming uncomfortably fierce, and again into the shore grape wood. We had already discovered to our pain that almost everything in the bush had prickles, of all imaginable shapes and sizes, and now, touching a low tree, one of our party was seized as by a briar, through clothes and into skin, and in escaping found on the tree Guilandina bonducella, rounded prickly pods, which being opened proved to contain the grey horse-knicker beads of our childhood. Up and down the white sand we wandered, collecting shells, as did the sailors gladly enough, and then rowed back over a bottom of white sand, bedded here and there with the short manati grass, Thalassia testudinum, one of the few flowering plants which, like our zostera or grass rack, grows at the bottom of the sea. But wherever the bottom was stony, we could see huge prickly sea urchins, huger brainstone corals, round and grey, and branching corals likewise, such as, when cleaned, may be seen in any curiosity shop. These, and a flock of brown and grey pelicans sailing over our head, were fresh tokens to us of where we were. As we were displaying our nosegay on deck on our return to some who had stayed stifling on board, and who were inclined, as West Indians are, at once to envy and to pooh-pooh the superfluous energy of new-come Europeans, R drew out a large and lovely flower, pale yellow with a tiny green apple or two, and leaves like those of an oleander. The brown lady, who was once again at her post on deck, walked up to her in silence, uninvited, and with a commanding air waved the thing away. "That manchineel, that poison, throw that overboard." R, who knew it was not manchineel, whispered to a bystander, "Ce n'est pas vrai." But the brown lady was a linguist. "Ah, mais c'est vrai," she cried, with flashing teeth, and retired, muttering her contempt of English ignorance and impertinence. And as it befell, she was, if not quite right, at least not quite wrong, for when we went into the cabin, we and our unlucky yellow flower were flown at by another brown lady in another gorgeous turban, who had become on the voyage a friend and an intimate, for she was the nurse of the baby who had been the light of the eyes of the whole quarter-deck ever since we left Southampton, God bless it, and its mother, and beautiful Monnid, where she dwells beneath the rock, as exquisite as one of her own hummingbirds. We were so scolded about this poor little green apple that we set to work to find put what it was, after promising at least not to eat it, and it proved to be Thevetia nerreifolia, and a very deadly poison. This was the first, though by no means the last, warning which we got not to meddle rashly with poison bush, lest that should befall us which befell a scientific West Indian of old. For hearing much of the edible properties of a certain European toadstool, he resolved to try a few experiments in his own person on West Indian ones, during the course of which he found himself one evening, after a good toadstool dinner, raving mad. The doctor was sent for and brought him round, a humbled man, but a heavier humiliation awaited him when his negro butler, who had long looked down on him for his botanical studies, entered with his morning cup of coffee. "Now, massa," said he in a tone of triumphant pity, "I think you no go out any more, cut bush and eat him." If we had wanted any further proof that we were in the tropics, we might have had it in the fearful heat of the next few hours, when the Shannon lay with a steamer on each side, one destined for the Gulf, the other for the islands, and not a breath of air was to be got till late in the afternoon, when amid shaking of hands and waving of handkerchiefs, as hearty as if we, the island-bound, and they, the Gulf-bound, and the officers of the Shannon had known each other 14 years instead of 14 days, we steamed out past the little Saba rock, which was said, but it seems incorrectly, to have burst into smoke and flame during the earthquake, and then away to the south and east for the islands, having had our first taste, but, thank God, not our last, of the joys of the earthly paradise. Chapter 2. Down the Islands. I had heard and read much from boyhood about these Lesser Antilles. I had pictured them to myself 1,000 times, but I was altogether unprepared for their beauty and grandeur. For hundreds of miles, day after day, the steamer carried us past a shifting diorama of scenery, which may be likened to Vesuvius and the Bay of Naples, repeated again and again, with every possible variation of the same type of delicate loveliness. Under a cloudless sky, upon a sea lively yet not unpleasantly rough, we thrashed and leaped along. Ahead of us, one after another, rose high on the southern horizon banks of grey cloud, from under each of which, as we neared it, descended the shoulder of a mighty mountain, dim and grey. Nearer still, the grey changed to purple. Lowlands rose out of the sea, sloping upwards with those grand and simple concave curves which betoken, almost always, volcanic land. Nearer still, the purple changed to green. Tall palm trees and engine houses stood out against the sky. The surf gleamed white around the base of isolated rocks. A little nearer, and we were under the lee or western side of the island. The sea grew smooth as glass. We entered the shade of the island cloud, and slid along in still, unfathomable blue water, close under the shore of what should have been one of the islands of the blessed. It was easy, in presence of such scenery, to conceive the exaltation which possessed the souls of the first discoverers of the West Indies. What wonder if they seemed to themselves to have burst into fairyland, to be at the gates of the earthly paradise. With such a climate, such soil, such vegetation, such fruits, what luxury must not have seemed possible to the dwellers along these shores? What riches, too, of gold and jewels might not be hidden among those forest-shrouded glens and peaks? And beyond again, ever new islands, new continents perhaps, an inexhaustible wealth of yet undiscovered worlds. No wonder that the men rose above themselves, for good and for evil, that having, as it seemed to them, found infinitely, they hoped infinitely, and dared infinitely. They were a dumb generation and an unlettered, those old conquistadores. They did not, as we do now, analyse and describe their own impressions, but they felt them nevertheless, and felt them, it may be, all the more intensely because they could not utter them, and so went half intoxicated by day and night with the beauty and the wonder round them, till the excitement overpowered alike their reason and their conscience. And frenzied with superstition and greed, with contempt and hatred of the heathen Indians, and often with mere drink and sunshine, they did deeds which, like all wicked deeds, avenge themselves, and are avenging themselves from Mexico to Chile unto this very day. I said that these islands resembled Vesuvius and the Bay of Naples. Like causes have produced like effects, and each island is little but the peak of a volcano, down whose shoulders lava and ash have slidden towards the sea. Some carry several crater cones, complicating at once the structure and scenery of the island. But the majority carry but a single cone, like that little island, or rather rock, of Saba, which is the first of the Antilles, under the lee of which the steamer passes. Santa Cruz, which is left to leeward, is a long, low, ragged island, of the same form as St. Thomas's and the Virgins, and belonging, I should suppose, to the same formation. But Saba rises sheer out of the sea some 1,500 feet or more, with flat ground or even harbour. From a little landing place to leeward a stair runs up 800 feet into the bosom of the old volcano, and in that hollow live some 1,200 honest Dutch and some 800 negroes who were, till of late years, their slaves, at least in law. But in Saba, it is said, the whites were really the slaves, and the negroes the masters, for they went off whither when they liked, earned money about the islands and brought it home, expected their masters to keep them when out of work, and not in vain. The island was, happily for it, too poor for sugar growing and the grand culture. The Dutch were never tempted to increase the number of their slaves, look upon the few they had as friends and children, and when emancipation came, no change whatsoever ensued, it is said, in the semi-feudal relation between the black men and the white. So these good Dutch live peacefully aloft in their volcano, which it is to be hoped will not explode again. They grow garden crops, among which I understand are several products of the temperate zone, the air being at the height pleasantly cool. They sell their produce about the islands. They build boats up in the crater, the best boats in all the West Indies, and lower them down the cliff to the sea. They hire themselves out too, not having lost their forefathers' sea-going instincts, as sailors about all these seas, and are, like their boats, the best in those parts. They all speak English, and, though they are nominally Lutherans, are glad of the services of the excellent Bishop of Antigua, who pays them periodical visits. He described them as virtuous, shrewd, simple, healthy folk, retaining, in spite of the tropic sun, the same clear white and red complexions which their ancestors brought from Holland 200 years ago. A proof amongst many that the white men need not degenerate in these isles. Suba has, like most of these islands, its somma, like that of Vesuvius, an outer ring of lava, the product of older eruptions, surrounding a central cone, the product of some newer one. But even this latter, as far as I could judge by the glass, is very ancient. Little more than the core of the central cone is left. The rest has been long since destroyed by rains and winds. A white cliff at the south end of the island should be examined by geologists. It belongs probably to that formation of tertiary calcareous marl so often seen in the West Indies, especially at Barbados. But if so, it must, to judge from the scar which it makes seaward, have been upheaved long ago, and like the whole island, and indeed all the islands, betokens an immense antiquity. Much more recent, in appearance at least, is the little isle of St. Eustatius, or at least the crater cone, with its lip broken down at one spot, which makes up 5/6 of the island. St. Eustatius may have been in eruption, but there is no record of it during historic times, and looks more unrepentant and capable of misbehaving itself again than does any other crater cone in the Antilles, far more so than the Soufriere in St. Vincent, which exploded in 1812. But these two are mere rocks. It is not until the traveller arrives at St. Kitts that he sees what a West Indian island is. The mother of the Antilles, as she is called, is worthy of her name. Everywhere from the shore the land sweeps up, slowly at first, then rapidly, toward the central mass, the rugged peak whereof goes by the name of Mount Misery. Only once, and then but for a moment, did we succeed in getting a sight of the actual summit, so pertinaciously did the clouds crawl round it. 3,700 feet aloft, a pyramid of black lava rises above the broken walls of an old crater, and is, to judge from its knife edge, flat top and concave eastern side, the last remnant of an inner cone which has been washed, or more probably blasted, away. Beneath it, according to the report of an islander, to Dr. Davy, and what I heard was to the same effect, is a deep hollow, longer than it is wide, without an outlet, walled in by precipices and steep declivities, from fissures in which steam and the fumes of sulphur are emitted. Sulphur in crystals abounds, encrusting the rocks and loose stones, and a stagnant pool of rainwater occupies the bottom of the soufriere, a dangerous neighbour. But as long as he keeps his temper, as he has done for 300 years at least, a most beneficent one, is this great hill which took in Columbus's imagination the form of the giant St. Christopher, bearing on his shoulder the infant Christ, and so gave the name to the whole island. From the lava and ash ejected from this focus, the whole soils of the island have been formed, soils of still unexhausted fertility, save when, as must needs be in a volcanic region, patches of mere rapilli and scoriae occur. The mountain has hurled these out, and everywhere, as a glance of the eye shows, the tropic rains are carrying them yearly down to the lowland, exposing fresh surfaces to the action of the air, and, by continual denudation and degradation, remanuring the soil. Everywhere, too, are gullies sawn in the slopes, which terminate above in deep and narrow glens, giving, especially when alternated with long lava streams, a ridge and furrow look to this and most other of the Antilles. Dr. Davy, with his usual acuteness of eye and soundness of judgment, attributes them rather to water acting on loose volcanic ashes than to rents and fissures, the result of sudden and violent force. Doubtless he is in the right. Thus, and thus only, has been formed the greater part of the most beautiful scenery in the West Indies. And I longed again and again, as I looked at it, for the company of my friend and teacher, Colonel George Greenwood, that I might show him, on island after island, such manifold corroborations of his theories in rain and rivers. But our eyes were drawn off at almost the second glance from mountain peaks and glens to the slopes of cultivated lowland, sheeted with bright green cane and guinea grass and pigeon pea, and that not for their own sakes, but for the sake of objects so utterly unlike anything which we had ever seen, that it was not easy at first to discover what they were. Grey pillars which seemed taller than the tallest poplars, smooth and cylindrical as those of a Doric temple, each carrying a flat head of darkest green, were ranged along roadsides and round fields, or stood in groups or singly near engine works, or towered above rich shrubberies which shrouded comfortable country houses. It was not easy, as I have said, to believe that these strange and noble things were trees, but such they were. At last we beheld with wonder and delight the pride of the West Indies, the cabbage palms, palmistes of the French settlers, which botanists have well named Oreodoxa, the glory of the mountains. We saw them afterwards 100 times in their own native forest, and when they rose through tangled masses of richest vegetation, mixed with other and smaller species of palms, their form, fantastic though it was, harmonized well with hundreds of forms equally fantastic. But here they seemed, at first sight, out of place, incongruous and artificial, standing amid no kindred forms, and towering above a cultivation and civilization which might have been mistaken, seen from the sea, for wealthy farms along some English shore. Gladly would we have gone on shore, were it but to have stood a while under those palmistes, and an invitation was not wanting to a pretty tree-shrouded house on a low cliff a mile off, where doubtless every courtesy and many a luxury would have awaited us. But it could not be. We watched kind folk rowed to shore without us, and then turned to watch the black flotilla under our quarter. The first thing that caught our eye on board the negro boats which were alongside was, of course, the baskets of fruit and vegetables, of which one of us at least had been hearing all his life. At St. Thomas's we had been introduced to bananas, figs as they are miscalled in the West Indies, to the great green oranges, thick-skinned and fragrant, to those junks of sugar cane, some 2 feet long, which Cuffy and Cuffy's ladies delight to gnaw, walking, sitting and standing, increasing thereby the size of their lips, and breaking out often enough their upper front teeth. We had seen and eaten too the sweet sop, a passable fruit, or rather congeries of fruits, looking like a green and purple strawberry, of the bigness of an orange. It is the cousin of the prickly sour sop, of the really delicious, but to me unknown, chirimoya, and of the custard apple, containing a pulp, which, as those who remember the delectable pages of Tom Cringle know, bears a startling likeness to brains. Bunches of grapes at St. Kitts lay among these, and at St. Lucia we saw with them for the first time avocado, or alligator pears, alias midshipman's butter, large round brown fruits, to be eaten with pepper and salt by those who list. With these, in open baskets, lay bright scarlet capsicums, green coconuts tinged with orange, great roots of yam and kush-kush, with strange pulse of various kinds and hues. The contents of these vegetable baskets were often as gay-coloured as the gaudy gowns, and still gaudier turbans of the women who offered them for sale. Screaming and jabbering, the negroes and negresses thrust each other's boats about, scramble from one to the other with gestures of wrath and defiance, and seemed at every moment about to fall to fisticuffs and to upset themselves among the sharks. But they did neither. Their excitement evaporated in noise. To their ladies, to do them justice, the men were always civil, while the said ladies bullied them and ordered them about without mercy. The negro women are, without doubt, on a more thorough footing of equality with the men than the women of any white race. The causes, I believe, are two. In the first place, there is less difference between the sexes in mere physical strength and courage. And watching the average negresses, one can well believe the stories of those terrible Amazonian guards of the King of Dahomey, whose boast is that they are no longer women, but men. There is no doubt that, in case of a rebellion, the black woman of the West Indies would be as formidable, cutlass in hand, as the men. The other cause is the exceeding ease with which not merely food, but gay clothes and ornaments can be procured by light labour. The negro woman has no need to marry and make herself the slave of a man in order to get a home and subsistence. Independent she is, for good and evil, and independent she takes care to remain, and no scheme for civilizing the negro will have any deep or permanent good effect which do not take note of, and legislate for, this singular fact. Meanwhile, it was a comfort to one fresh from the cities of the old world, and the short and stunted figures, the mesquin and scrofulous visages which crowd our alleys and back wynds, to see everywhere health, strength, and goodly stature, especially among women. Nowhere in the West Indies are to be seen these haggard, downtrodden mothers grown old before their time, too common in England, and commoner still in France. Health, rude in every sense of the word, is the mark of the negro woman, and of the negro man likewise. Their faces shine with fatness. They seem to enjoy, they do enjoy, the mere act of living, like the lizard on the wall. It may be said, it must be said, that if they be human beings, as they are meant for something more than mere enjoyment of life. Well and good, but are they not meant for enjoyment likewise? Let us take the beam out of our own eye before we take the mote out of theirs. Let us, before we complain of them for being too healthy and comfortable, remember that we have at home here tens of thousands of paupers, rogues, what not, who are not a whit more civilized, intellectual, virtuous, or spiritual than the negro, and are meanwhile neither healthy nor comfortable. The negro may have the corpus sanum without the mens sana. But what of those whose souls and bodies are alike unsound? Away south, along the low spit at the south end of the island, where are salt pans which, I suspect, lie in now extinguished craters, and past Little Nevis, the conical ruin, as it were, of a volcanic island. It was probably joined to the low end of St. Kitts not many years ago. It is separated from it now only by a channel called the Narrows, some 4 to 6 miles across, and very shallow, there being not more than 4 fathoms in many places, and infested with reefs. Whether of true coral or of volcanic rock, I should be glad to know. A single peak with its soufriere rises to some 2,000 feet, right and left of it are two lower hills, fragments apparently of a somma, or older and larger crater. The lava and ash slide in concave slopes of fertile soil down to the sea, forming an island some 4 miles by 3, which was in the 17th century a little paradise, containing 4,000 white citizens who had dwindled down in 1805 under the baneful influences of slavery to 1,300. In 1832, the period of emancipation, to 500, and in 1854 to only 170. A happy place, however, it is said still to be, with a population of more than 10,000, who, as there is happily no crown land in the island, cannot squat, and so return to their original savagery, but are well-ordered and peaceable, industrious and well-taught, and need, it is said, not only no soldiers, but no police. One spot on the little island we should have liked much to have seen, the house where Nelson, after his marriage with Mrs. Nisbet, a lady of Nevis, dwelt a while in peace and purity. Happier for him, perhaps, though not for England, had he never left that quiet nest. And now, on the leeward bow, another grey mountain island rose, and on the windward another, lower and longer. The former was Montserrat, which I should have gladly visited, as I had been invited to do, for little Montserrat is just now the scene of a very hopeful and important experiment. The Messrs. Sturge have established there a large plantation of limes and a manufactory of lime juice, which promises to be able to supply in good time vast quantities of that most useful of all sea medicines. Their connection with the Society of Friends, and indeed the very name of Sturge, is a guarantee that such a work will be carried on for the benefit not merely of the capitalists, but of the coloured people who are employed. Already, I am assured, a marked improvement has taken place among them, and I, for one, heartily bid Godspeed to the enterprise, to any enterprise indeed which tends to divert labour and capital from that exclusive sugar growing which has been most injurious, I verily believe the bane of the West Indies. On that subject I may have to say more in a future chapter. I ask the reader, meanwhile, to follow as the ship's head goes round to windward towards Antigua. Antigua is lower, longer, and flatter than the other islands. It carries no central peak, but its wildness of ragged uplands forms, it is said, a natural fortress which ought to be impregnable, and its loyal and industrious people boast that where every other West Indian island lost, the English might make a stand in Antigua long enough to enable them to reconquer the whole. I should have feared from the looks of the island that no large force could hold out long in a country so destitute of water as those volcanic hills, rusty, ragged, treeless, almost sad and desolate. If any land could be sad and desolate with such a blue sea leaping around and such a blue sky blazing above. Those who wish to know the agricultural capabilities of Antigua, and to know, too, the good sense and courage, the justice and humanity which have enabled the Antiguans to struggle on and upward through all their difficulties, in spite of drought, hurricane, and earthquake, till permanent prosperity seems now become certain, should read Dr. Davies' excellent book, which I cannot too often recommend. For us, we could only give a hasty look at its southern volcanic cliffs, while we regretted that we could not inspect the marine strata of the eastern parts of the island, with their calcareous marls and limestones, hardened clays and cherts, and famous silicified trees, which offer important problems to the geologist, as yet not worked out. We could well believe, as the steamer ran into English harbour, that Antigua was still subject to earthquakes, and had been shaken with great loss of property, though not of life, in the Guadeloupe earthquake of 1843, when 5,000 lives were lost in the town of Pointe-de-Pitre alone. The only well-marked effect which Dr. Davy could hear of, apart from damage to artificial structures, was the partial sinking of a causeway leading to Rat Island in the harbour of St. John. No wonder if St. John's harbour be, as from its shape on the map it probably is, simply an extinct crater or group of craters like English harbour. A more picturesque or more uncanny little hole than that latter we had never yet seen. But there are many such harbours about these islands which nature, for the time being at least, has handed over from the dominion of fire to that of water. Past low cliffs of ash and volcanic border, sloping westward to the sea which is eating them fast away, the steamer runs in through a deep crack, a pistol shot in width. On the east side, a strange section of grey lava and ash is gnawn into caves. On the right, a bluff rock of black lava dips sheer into water several fathoms deep, and you anchor at once inside an irregular group of craters, having passed through a gap in one of their sides, which has probably been torn out by a lava flow. Whether the land at the time of the flow was higher or lower than at present, who can tell? This is certain, that the first basin is for half of its circumference circular and walled with ash beds, which seem to slope outward from it. To the left it leads away into a long creek, up which, somewhat to our surprise, we saw neat government houses and quays, and between them and us a noble ironclad and other ships of war at anchor close against lava and ash cliffs. But right ahead, the dusty sides of the crater are covered with strange bushes, its glaring shingle-spotted with bright green manganiels, while on the cliffs around, aloes innumerable, seemingly the imported American agave, send up their groups of huge fat-pointed leaves from crannies so arid that one would fancy a moss would wither in them. A strange place it is, and strangely hot likewise, and one could not but fear a day, it is to be hoped long distant, when it will be hotter still. Out of English harbour, after taking on board fruit and bargaining for beads, for which Antigua is famous, we passed the lonely rock of Redonda toward a mighty mountain which lay under a sheet of clouds of corresponding vastness. That was Guadeloupe. The dark undersides of the rolling clouds mingled with the dark peaks and ridges, till we could not see where earth ended and vapour began. And the clouds from far to the eastward up the wind massed themselves on the island, and then ceased suddenly to leeward, leaving the sky clear and the sea brilliant. I should be glad to know the cause of this phenomenon, which we saw several times among the islands, but never in greater perfection than on nearing Nevis from the south on our return. In that case, however, the cloud continued to leeward. It came up from the east for full 10 miles, an advancing column of tall, ghostly cumuli, leaden above a leaden sea, and slid toward the island, whose lines seemed to leap up once to meet them, fail, then, in a second leap, to plunge the crater peak high into the mist, and then to sink down again into the western sea, so gently that the line of shore and sea was indistinguishable. But above, the cloud procession passed on, shattered by its contact with the mountain, and transfigured as it neared the setting sun into long, upward streaming lines of wrack, purple and primrose against a saffron sky, while Venus lingered low between cloud and sea, a spark of fire glittering through dull red haze. And now the steamer ran due south, across the vast basin which is ringed round by Antigua, Montserrat and Guadeloupe, with St. Kitts and Nevis showing like tall grey ghosts to the northwest. Higher and higher ahead rose the great mountain mass of Guadeloupe, its head in its own canopy of cloud. The island falls into the sea sharply leeward, but it stretches out to windward in a long line of flat land edged with low cliff, and studded with large farms and engine houses. It might be a bit of the Isle of Thanet or of the Lothians, were it not for those umbrella-like palmistes, 100 feet high, which stand out everywhere against the sky. At its northern end, a furious surf was beating on a sandy beach, and beyond that, dim and distant, loomed up the low, flat farther island, known by the name of Grande Terre. Guadeloupe, as some of my readers may know, consists, properly speaking, of 2 islands, divided by a swamp and a narrow salt-water river. The eastward half, or Grande Terre, which is composed of marine strata, is hardly seen in the island voyage, and then only at a distance, first behind the westward Bassa Terra, and then behind other little islands, the Santes and Marie Galante. But the westward island, rising in one lofty volcanic mass which hides the eastern island from view, is perhaps for mere grandeur the greatest in the archipelago. The mountains, among which are, it is said, 14 extinct craters, range upward higher and higher toward the southern end, with corries and glens which must be, when seen near, hanging gardens of stupendous size. The forests seem to be as magnificent as they were in the days of Père Labat, tiny knots on distant cliff tops, when looked at through the glass, are found to be single trees of enormous height and breadth. Gullies hundreds of feet in depth, rushing downwards to the sea, represent the rush of the torrents which have helped through thousands of rainy seasons to scoop them out and down. But all this grandeur and richness culminates towards the southern end in one great crater peak, 5,000 feet in height, at the foot of which lies the port of Basse-Terre, or Bourg Saint-François. We never were so fortunate as to see the Soufriere entirely free from cloud. The lower, wider, and more ancient crater was generally clear, but out of the mist of it rose a second cone buried in darkness and mist. Once only we caught sight of part of its lip. The sight was one not to be forgotten. The sun was rising behind the hills, the purple mountain was backed by clear blue sky. High above it hung sheets of orange cloud, lighted from underneath. Lower down, and close upon the hilltops, curved sheets of bright white mist, stooped from heaven and took the shape with fold on fold of mountain and of cape. And under them again the crater seethed with grey mist, among which at one moment we could discern portions of its lip, not smooth, like that of Vesuvius, but broken into awful peaks and chasms, hundreds of feet in height. As the sun rose, level lights of golden green streamed around the peak right and left over the downs, but only for a while. As the sky clouds vanished in his blazing rays, earth clouds rolled up below from the valleys behind, wreathed and weltered about the great black teeth of the crater, and then, sinking among them, and below them, shrouded the whole cone in purple darkness for the day, while in the foreground blazed in sunshine broad slopes of cane field. Below them again the town, with handsome houses and old-fashioned churches and convents, dating possibly from the 17th century, embowered in mangoes, tamarinds, and palmistes, and along the beach a market beneath a row of trees, with canoes drawn up to be unladen, and gay dresses of every hue. The surf whispered softly on the beach. The cheerful murmur of voices came off the shore, and above it the tinkling of some little bell, calling good folks to early mass. A cheery, brilliant picture as man could wish to see, but marred by two ugly elements. A mile away on the low northern cliff, marked with many a cross, was the lonely Cholera Cemetery, a remembrance of the fearful pestilence which a few years since swept away thousands of people, and above frowned that black giant now asleep. But for how long? In 1797, an eruption hurled out pumice, ashes, and sulphurous vapours. In the great crisis of 1812, indeed, the volcano was quiet, leaving the soufriere of St. Vincent to do the work. But since then he has shown an ugly and uncertain humour. Smoke by day and flame by night, or probably that light reflected from below, which is often mistaken for flame in volcanic eruptions, have been seen again and again above the crater, and the awful earthquake of 1843 proves that his capacity for mischief is unabated. The whole island, indeed, is somewhat unsafe, for the hapless town of Pointe-à-Pitre, destroyed by that earthquake, stands not on volcanic Bassa Terra, but on the edge of the marine Grande Terre, near the southern mouth of the Saltwater River. Heaven grant these good people of Guadeloupe a long respite, for they are said to deserve it, as far as human industry and enterprise goes. They have as well, I understand, as the gentlemen of Martinique, discovered the worth of the division of labour. Throughout the West Indies, the planter is usually not merely a sugar grower, but a sugar maker also. He requires, therefore, 2 capitals, and 2 intellects likewise, one for his cane fields, the other for his ingenio, engine house or sugar works, but he does not gain thereby 2 profits. Having 2 things to do, neither usually is well done. The cane farming is bad, the sugar making bad, and the sugar, when made, disposed of through merchants by a cumbrous, antiquated, and expensive system. These shrewd Frenchmen, and I am told, even small proprietors amongst the negroes, not being crippled, happily for them, by those absurd sugar duties which, till Mr. Lowe's budget put a premium on the making of bad sugar, are confining themselves to growing the canes and sell them raw to usines centrales, at which they are manufactured into sugar. They thus devote their own capital and intellect to increasing the yield of their estates, while the central factories, it is said, pay dividends ranging from 20 to 40%. I regretted much that I was unable to visit in crop time one of these factories, and see the working of a system which seems to contain one of the best elements of the cooperative principle. But, and this is at present a serious inconvenience to a traveller in the Antilles, the steamer passes each island only once a fortnight. so that to land in an island is equivalent to staying there at least that time, unless one chooses to take the chances of a coasting schooner, and bad food, bugs, cockroaches, and a bunk, but I will not describe. Non ragionum di lor ma guarda, down the companion, e passa. I must therefore content myself with describing, as honestly as I can, what little we saw from the sea, of islands of which we would gladly have stayed several days. As the traveller nears each of them, Guadeloupe, Dominica, Martinique, of which two last we had only one passing glance, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, and Grenada, he will be impressed not only by the peculiarity of their form, but by the richness of their colour. All of them do not, like St. Kitts, Guadeloupe, and St. Vincent, slope up to one central peak. In Martinique, for instance, there are three separate peaks, or groups of peaks: the Mont Pelé, the Piton du Carbet, and the Piton du Vauclin. But all have that peculiar jagged outline which is noticed first at the Virgin Islands. Flat vans or hog-backed hills and broad sweeps of moorland, so common in Scotland, are as rare as are steep walls of cliff so common in the Alps. Pyramid is piled on pyramid, the sides of each at a slope of about 45 degrees, till the whole range is a congeries of multitudinous peaks and peaklets, round the base of which spreads out with a sudden sweep the smooth lowland of volcanic ash and lava. This extreme raggedness of outline is easily explained. The mountains have never been, as in Scotland, planed smooth by ice. They have been gouged out in every direction by the furious tropic rains and tropical rain torrents. Had the rocks been stratified and tolerably horizontal, these rains would have cut them out into tablelands divided by deep gullies, such as may be seen in Abyssinia and in certain parts of the western United States. But these rocks are altogether amorphous and unstratified, and have been poured or spouted out as lumps, dikes, and sheets of lava, of every degree of hardness, so that the rain, in degrading them, has worn them not into tables and ranges, but into innumerable cones, and the process of degradation is still going on rapidly. Though a cliff or sheet of bare rock is hardly visible among the glens, yet here and there a bright brown patch tells of a recent landslip, and the masses of debris and banks of shingle, backed by a pestilential little swamp at the mouth of each torrent, shows how furious must be the downpour and down-roll before the force of a sudden flood along so headlong an incline. But in strange contrast with the ragged outline, and with the wild devastation of the rainy season, is the richness of the verdure which clothes the islands, up to their highest peaks in what seems a coat of green fur, but when looked at through the glasses proves to be, in most cases, gigantic timber. Not a rock is seen. If there be a cliff here and there, it is as green as an English lawn. Steep slopes are grey with gru-gru palms, or yellow with unknown flowering trees. High against the skyline, tiny knots and lumps are found to be gigantic trees. Each glen has buried its streamlet 100 feet in vegetation, above which, here and there, the grey stem and dark crown of some palmiste towers up like the mast of some great admiral. The eye and the fancy strain vainly into the green abysses, and wander up and down over the wealth of depths and heights, compared with which European parks and woodlands are but paltry scrub and shore. No books are needed to tell that. The eye discovers it for itself, even before it has learnt to judge of the great size of the vegetation from the endless variety of form and colour. For the islands, though green intensely, are not of one but of every conceivable green, or rather of hues ranging from pale yellow through all greens into cobalt blue. And as the wind stirs the leaves and sweeps the lights and shadows over the hill and glen, all is ever changing, iridescent like a peacock's neck, till the whole island from peak to shore seems some glorious jewel, an emerald with tints of sapphire and topaz, hanging between blue sea and white surf below, and blue sky and white cloud above. If the reader fancies that I exaggerate, let him go and see. Let him lie for 1 hour off the Russo at Dominica. Let him sail down the leeward side of Guadeloupe, down the leeward side of what island he will, and judge for himself how poor and yet how tawdry my words are, compared with the luscious yet magnificent colouring of the Antilles. The traveller, at least so I think, would remark also, with some surprise, the seeming smallness of these islands. The Bassa Terra of Guadeloupe, for instance, is 40 miles in length. As you lie off it, it does not look half or even a quarter of that length, and that not merely because the distances north and south are foreshortened or shut in by nearer headlands. The causes, I believe, are more subtle and more complex. First, the novel clearness of the air, which makes the traveller, fresh from misty England, fancy every object far nearer, and therefore far smaller than it actually is. Next, the simplicity of form. Each outer line trends upward, so surely toward a single focus. Each hole is so sharply defined between its baseline of sea and its background of sky that, like a statue, each island is compact and complete in itself, an isolated and self-dependent organism, and therefore, like every beautiful statue, it looks much smaller than it is. So perfect this isolation seems that one fancies at moments that the island does not rise out of the sea, but floats upon it. That it is held in place not by the roots of the mountains and deep miles of lava wall below, but by the cloud which has caught it by the top and will not let it go. Let that cloud but rise and vanish, and the whole beautiful thing will be cast adrift, ready to fetch way before the wind, and, as it will seem often enough to do when viewed through a cabin port, to slide silently past you while you are sliding past it. And yet, to him who knows the past, a dark shadow hangs over all this beauty, and the air, even in clearest blaze of sunshine, is full of ghosts. I do not speak of the shadows of Negro slavery, nor of the shadow which, though abolished, it has left behind, not to be cleared off for generations to come. I speak of the shadow of war, and the ghosts of gallant soldiers and sailors. Truly here, the spirits of our fathers might start from every wave, for the deck it was their field of fame, and ocean was their grave. And ask us, what have you done with these islands, which we won for you with precious blood? What could we answer? We have misused them, neglected them, till now, ashamed of the slavery of the past, and too ignorant and helpless to govern them now slavery is gone. we are half-minded to throw them away again, or to allow them to annex themselves in sheer weariness at our imbecility to the Americans, who, far too wise to throw them away in their turn, will accept them gladly as an instalment of that great development of their empire when the stars and stripes shall float upon Cape Horn. But was it for this that these islands were taken and retaken, till every galley held the skeleton of an Englishman? Was it for this that these seas were reddened with blood year after year, till the sharks learnt to gather to a sea fight as eagle, kite and wolf gathered of old to fights on land? Did all those gallant souls go down to Hades in vain, and leave nothing for the Englishman but the sad and proud memory of their useless valour? That at least they have left. However we may deplore those old wars as unnecessary, however much we may hate war itself, as perhaps the worst of all the superfluous curses with which man continues to deface himself and this fair earth of God, yet one must be less than Englishman, less, it may be, than man, if one does not feel a thrill of pride at entering waters where one says to oneself, "Here Rodney, on the glorious 12th of April, 1782, broke Count de Grasse's line, teaching thereby Nelson to do the same in like case. Took and destroyed 7 French ships of the line and scattered the rest, preventing the French fleet from joining the Spaniards at Hispaniola, thus saving Jamaica and the whole West Indies, and brought about by that single tremendous blow the honourable peace of 1783. On what a scene of crippled and sinking, shattered and triumphant ships, in what a sea must the conquerors have looked round from the Formidable's poop, with De Grasse at luncheon with Rodney in the cabin below, and not, as he had most boastfully promised, on board his own Files de Paris. Truly, though cynically, wrote Sir Gilbert Blane, if superior beings make a sport of the quarrels of mortals, they could not have chosen a better theatre for this magnificent exhibition, nor could they ever have better entertainment